views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
And hello, everyone, and welcome to the Social Justice Forum. I am Daren, Jaime, and of course, we thank you for joining us. If anybody asks the question, what is the Social Justice Forum all about? Well, it's an opportunity to have conversation, go into deeper dialogue about many of the issues of social justice. It's beyond police brutality. It's beyond mass incarceration. There's economic injustice. There's environmental justice. There's food injustice. There's so many things that are tied to social justice, and we bring that to you right here on the show. We talk about the inequities that many people face, particularly in communities of color, and then we also present multiple viewpoints and invite you to share in on the discussion. So get ready to share with us. The Social Justice Forums starts right now. Well, kicking off our show, the Bronx remembers Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Ginsburg was hailed as a champion and a trailblazer for women's rights here in our borough. Ginsburg, also known as RPG, was appointed to serve the nation's highest court in 1993. She died on September the 18th due to complications from pancreatic cancer. Here in the Bronx at Lou Gehrig's Plaza on 161st Street, people took to the streets in remembrance of RBG. Our BronxNet reporter Arlene Makoko brings us the story.
She was hailed as a champion and a trailblazer for women's rights here at Lou Gehrig Plaza next to the Bronx Supreme Courthouse building on 161st Street.
She was a leader, and she stood up and spoke out and advocated for those who didn't have a voice. And that's what I've always, measured my life by, being able to help others, speaking when others could not. Not accepting no for an answer, just really being a fierce advocate. And that's who she was till the day she died. And she worked hard until the moment she passed.
Also known as RGB, Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark shared the Supreme Court Justice who served 27 years on the bench drew thousands of admirers, herself included, for not only her pioneering positions, but also the collar she wore, expressing her position on decisions being made in the court.
Well, even if the majority saw the other way, she was not afraid to tell them how they were wrong. That's why I have this pin here. This is the dissent pin. She wore those collars when she was going to dissent.
As the second woman to hold a seat after Sandra Day O'Connor, Justice Ginsburg broke with tradition to do what was right for all.
And she was a giant among all of us and a real loss to our nation.
Also applauding Ginsburg's career that came to a close September 18th at the age of 87 was Councilmember Vanessa Gibson, chair of the New York City Council's Women's Caucus.
She lived through adversity, through struggles, through challenges, through racism, discrimination, gender inequity, and yet she persevered. She is a living testament of how you can survive and overcome when you feel that injustice is like rearing its ugly head. And I'm grateful that all of us, members of the judiciary, elected officials, we all stand on her shoulders because she really did pave the way.
With Bronx judges joining in the tribute, she was remembered for also transcending the legal profession to become a part of pop culture with a movie chronicling her rise to prominence.
She was just one person at the end of the day, and yet this is her legacy. So we all really kind of have an obligation to do that as well, in whatever way it is that speaks most to us and to our convictions, to put them out there, and even when it's scary, and even when, maybe people aren't necessarily asking for that.
She was outspoken and courageous in being that way, and it's something Bronx leaders here want the public here to continue doing in her honor. For BronxNet, this is Arlene Makoko.
And thank you, Arlene. Well, EduColor is an organization founded by, with, and for people of color. The organization serves as an inclusive cooperative of informed, inspired, and motivated educators, parents, students, as well as writers and activists who promote and embrace the centrality of substantive intersectional diversity. EduColor also mobilizes, advocates nationwide around issues of educational equity, agency, and justice. Now, they amplify the works and ideas of students and educators in communities of color through supportive on and offline networks and professional development. EduColor also seeks to develop and elevate the voices of public school advocates of color on educational equity and justice. Joining us now to provide some insight into this matter and talking about the work they do, I'm joined by the executive director and co-founder of EduColor, Jose Vilson. And Jose, good to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And when we talk about social justice, obviously part of that social justice component is really dealing with the whole issue of education and the educational injustices as well as the educational gap. So EduColor, of course, seeks to deal with that gap in education. Talk to us a little about your organization.
Well, EduColor, thankfully, is an organization dedicated to any number of issues related to education. But we noticed that so much of our work isn't necessarily innovative as it is transformative and intergenerational. We've known over time that Black educators in this country took it upon themselves to collectively and individually assure that their own understandings and their own stories were pushed into the communities in which they served. So when we look at EduColor, we think about that as the continuation for a new generation of educators who, in this moment of the Black Lives Matter movement, Fight for 15, any number of social and intergenerational issues, that we stand to assure that our issues, our understandings, whether we're coming from different countries, different nationalities, different understandings of the world, that we all come together collectively to build upon what our education needs to be to make sure that our most vulnerable and marginalized students are able to either have a seat at the table, or that we create a whole new table and make sure we build seats around that to ensure that everybody has an equal share of what we're supposed to be doing for all of our students and our communities.
Yeah. And when we look at what's going on with students in our communities right now, we know that students are having a lot of challenges trying to rise right now and just overcoming challenges of COVID-19 with virtual learning. That presents its own set of challenges. But pre-COVID-19, there were a lot of challenges that, students of color had to necessarily navigate through. I know some of the work that you do is about policy and initiative. So talk to us a little bit about that policy. And I know you've got a 7-point policy that you're talking about too.
Well, it's interesting because I think what people really have to recognize is that this moment has only exacerbated inequity. It hasn't necessarily revealed it for those of us who are of color and of conscious, right? So recognize how we knew for a fact that we weren't necessarily getting equitable Wi-Fi. We weren't getting equitable hotspots. We weren't getting all the technology to all of our schools before COVID. And now with COVID, if this is the only experience that we're allowed to be able to have schooling, then this is gonna be an issue. And we should have been prepared for that long before a global pandemic hit our shores. So that's one. And then two, when it comes to the process of schooling, there's any number of different students who are struggling right now. So, we have one set of students who they are the children of essential workers. I know for a fact some of my own students have had parents and relatives who passed away around them. And so that presented its own set of challenges, and trying to live in a home where it may not necessarily feel like they're allowed to be the full-on students that they want to be, whether they live in multi-generational homes with 5 or 6 children all trying to share the same amount of Wi-Fi, or even just the regular day-to-day not being able to concentrate. So that's one end. But then you have this really interesting set of students who, on the other end, actually like being away from the school building because of the lack of distractions, and also because they feel like their school maybe doesn't love them back in the same way. So they're able to just get the learning that they need and extract that learning without having to deal with all the processes of schooling. And so when you have this really interesting dichotomy happening, that means that we need to reform school and maybe transform school so that it can better match the experiences of our students who so desperately need both an equitable education and one that is anti-racist and pro their humanity and their understandings of the world.
So as you talk about navigating that, I hear you. And I think that those things are very noble because they need to happen. And we talk about, educational fairness. And sometimes when it comes to communities of color, we do not get that in the area of educational fairness. We're talking, this show's about social justice, right? And dealing with the issues that are affecting communities of color more particularly. But when we talk about educational injustice, what are some of the things that you look at and say, boom, for somebody who may be not watching this program right now and saying, listen, I don't know about educational injustice. That doesn't really exist. Can you please educate somewhat? on where you can provide good examples to somebody who may be a novice about what educational injustice looks like from a person from a community of color?
There are a plethora of issues to delve in, right? And we know this for a fact, but I kind of just want to highlight three of them. The first of them is the pedagogy and curriculum that our students deserve and versus what they get. We have any number of schools, as we know, in the last 20 years, for example, that have only focused solely on English and math as the sole levers for whether or not our kids are learning, but we neglect things like science and social studies, which, as you can tell, are so desperately needed in the middle of a global pandemic. We lost the arts, we lost music in so many of our schools because we were so focused on English and math scores that we totally forgot about a well-rounded education and a global citizenry that would better our world. So that's one. Two, we see serious issues when it comes to discipline and punishment. How often do we hear stories of students who felt like they can tell you that their schools feel like prisons and they've never been to a prison? That tells me that we have a clear indication that our kids feel like too many of the adults around them, whether it's teachers, the deans, assistant principals, principal, whoever, they make them feel like they are less of a human being. And this is happening in places that are predominantly Black, predominantly brown, predominantly poor schools across the city. And in the Bronx, forget about it. Like, we know what that looks like. And so kids are fighting back against police being in schools precisely because of that dynamic, instead of trying to create a system that is more restorative, more transformative towards that justice. And then third, we recognize too that so many of the kids that are in our school buildings may not have ever been to a private school, but they know that those private schools have a totally different experience where they don't have to walk through metal detectors. They have teachers who actually respond to their needs and concerns, who are actually flexible about how they receive assignments. And wherever they are firm, they actually are responsive to the parents who, whenever I hear policies around how white parents got angry, I'm always like, well, that just means that the Black parents were usually ignored first. The Latino, Hispanic parents were ignored first. And when that dynamic happens, that means that we need to reverse course and go back to what the concerns were for Black and brown parents who first said, hey, like, you're stripping away resources from my kid and trying to privatize it, charterize it, whatever have you. But then all the while, white children don't necessarily have the same experience in the schools that they attend. Even if they call public schools, these public schools are often very responsive to what white parents have to say versus what Black and brown parents often have to do in order to get just even a modicum of justice and equity in their own schools.
Yeah, and the other part to that is also resources, right? When we talk about resources, it seems as though when you talk about Black and brown students, they always have a struggle with the access to resources. It always has to be that. You talk about classrooms and you look at class sizes. In many cases, when you talk about public schools in the New York City public school system, we know of overcrowded classrooms. And so the learning environment when it comes to school students and teachers really, becomes somewhat compromised. But I want to talk about that for a moment, because when we talk about social justice, we talk about educational justice, access to resources. Talk about how, even the work in what you're doing in your organization is really bridging that gap.
Absolutely. So some of the things that we've tried to do is we recognize that historically speaking, Black teachers didn't always have the same resources that their white counterparts did from a historical perspective. So what did we do? We tried to transform the school and the pedagogy itself to better accommodate. So even the schools that may not necessarily have had good resources had enough of a strong pedagogy that affirmed our children, that's one, and affirmed their understandings and the learnings of the world. And then we're able to prepare them for a world that may or may not receive them well. That sort of cultural responsiveness was the backbone for that lack of resource when we never got the resources that we fully deserved, right? And so the pushback that a lot of people say is, well, that just means that we need more people to come back and like try to give back to the hood, which, yes, I'm in agreement with, but that also means that we need to create things and like taxes, for example, like we need to destroy systems such as redlining, which often pushes so many of our Black and brown parents out of the neighborhoods that they often reside in favor of white folks who have the trust funds and who have the funds. And so they get pulled out of their own schools, even when they finally got it to a point where, yes, this feels more equitable. just resources, like even things like food security and health security. We know for a fact that so many of our schools aren't just the #1 site for where our kids get our education, but it ends up being the #1 site for where they get their lunches and sometimes for breakfast, as well as where they get their dental, where they get their nurses and appointments, and where they get maybe some, I guess, psychology or whatever have you. They get the psychiatrist. I mean, these are things that, these are well-rounded services that, yes, all of our kids deserve. And unfortunately, without some of our schools and without the resources that those schools provide, our kids are left with next to nothing, if not anything at all.
So walk us through your program and exactly what you actually provide for students and helping in this process.
For one, our organization does a few things well. Number one is that we focus on professional development. Our understandings of cultural responsiveness have been used not just in policy spaces with organizations such as the Center for American Progress and different universities and, you know, teachers, colleges, whatever have you, but also we've been able to go to certain communities and actually develop professional development with white teachers who often need that understanding of how we operate in the classroom. We've been able to have the conversations around what it looks like to be anti-racist in those spaces, what it looks like to actually create educational justice for our kids, even when there's a lack of resource. We're able to step in and say, okay, so, you know, given what you have, how are we going to construct a better experience for our children? And this especially matters not just during a global pandemic, but during the re-rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. We understand that, like, EduColor came from the understandings that anti-racism meant that we get to pull all of humanity up. And so when teachers struggled with how to have a discussion around this racial uprising, EduColor stood tall and said, here's how you do it. You start having the conversations, you open yourself up, you become vulnerable, you talk about your own experiences growing up, whether you were a white person from the suburbs or a Black person from the hood and everywhere in between. And then you change your pedagogy, whether you change your libraries and the things that you're reading, or you think about how you can create multiple types of assessments to make sure that your students are able to actually contribute to the class instead of just looking for one narrow measure. Our organization has done all this, by the way, with mostly all volunteers, right? They may get a stipend here and there, including myself, but generally speaking, we've been able to do this through the works and the love that people have for the work itself. And so not just from a policy perspective, where we're in those meetings with different policymakers, but also with actual classroom educators and leaders who want to create in-house policy to make sure that all the kids get the education they deserve. And of course, not to mention resisting forms of punitive approaches to the classroom, making sure that the quote unquote bad kids actually stay in the classroom through more healthy and vibrant conversations, through transformative approaches to how we discuss, I guess, whatever punishment it may be, even the relationships between parents. It's like, all right, how are you going to talk to your parent? How are you going to talk to the parents of the children that are there? Not just from a deficit standpoint, but from a strength-based standpoint, and say, hey, your child is gifted, your child is able to do this. How can we best build a relationship with parents in the communities to pull them into the classroom experience, even when they can't necessarily make it? That sort of conversation has led to a lot of transformation for so many communities in which we serve on the national scale.
Yeah, when we talk about cultural competence, I mean, that's huge, right? Because when you have students and, you know, you can have somebody who lives on one side of town who's teaching someone from another side of town. You've got teachers who come in from, you know, the burbs, and they come in and they're educating students within a city school district. There is a huge cultural competence that has to take place. You talk about the instruction of, you know, educating teachers in that kind of area. Give me what kind of responses you're getting, and what with boots on the ground. Share with me a little bit about what you're hearing from these teachers who have the opportunity to engage in cultural competence in a way in which they may have never done it before. Because we know for students, right, sometimes the first time I see an African-American teacher or a teacher of color isn't until years into the system, because we understand that sometimes those teachers of colors just aren't present.
That is so fascinating too, because it's so, like, as the more complex this work gets, the better and closer we get, I think, to this idea of a shared humanity and shared justice. So I think about, we have the plethora of white teachers across the entire school system, and many of them believe that maybe, you know, if we teach Black kids, then we need to just like, you know, do whatever the Black kids are doing and try to inculcate ourselves into all that. And all the while you're like, yeah, but the parents are telling you to educate the child and actually give them what they deserve, what they need when it comes to the classroom. So in the ways that you can break down your own biases about what Black children need, what brown children need, what Asian children need, what First Indigenous Nation, what any of the folks who are, I guess, people of color, what they may need, in the ways that you listen actively, right? And then how you change your entire units and your understanding of the studies, and how you walk around and ask questions and try not to make yourself the power center, because you have 30 people in the classroom who could technically, you know, stage an uprising against you if they really wanted to in the class. And I'm sure there are some white teachers who are like, oh snap, I'm nervous. And that's why they try to do really punitive things, right? And all the while we're like, no, actually, you should take advantage of that and make them the teachers and try to level the playing field so that they don't feel like you have to be the one authority figure with all the wisdom, and you can make all of them feel like they belong in the class. And that helps not just people of color, that helps white kids too, because too many of the white kids end up being like the CEOs, the managers who got like, you know, the jobs from their fathers or mothers or whatever have you. And they have to be able to also look at their fellow peers of color and say, hey, you are a human being just like me. We both need to have a better conversation about that, because until all of the folks who we have to be in charge of, whether they are white or people of color, have an understanding that people of color are human beings as well, then we can never get to educational justice. And that includes the resources, that includes the types of schools that they go to, that would include the professional development of the white teachers who consistently ask Black people to stand for a pledge of allegiance that doesn't always give them the liberty and justice for everybody, right?
Right.
So these are all understandings that I hope EduColor is able to push onto anybody who's listening, anybody who's watching, anybody who we serve, because the responses I usually get is like, oh, like this is just some racial hooey or whatever have you. But then you start going into the conversations and like, you know, chipping away, and the things that we do to chip away at that often ends up being where at the end the teacher's like, I am really grateful for that experience, and you really opened my eyes to something that I didn't see. And we've done this for hundreds of teachers across the country, whether through our Twitter chats or through our own live professional development, whatever we could, or through our own sessions that we've had virtually. So in that case, we've been blessed.
Do people get the opportunity to understand the real hurdle and the obstacle of food insecurity and how that's playing out in the lives of our children? I mean, when we talk about food insecurity, we know that a lot of kids go to school and they go to school. School's the only place where they can probably get a meal. And when they return home, they don't have that meal. And for a lot of kids in the midst of this COVID pandemic, this has really been a huge challenge.
You can't do anti-racism if you don't understand it from a systemic level. It is not just when people get mad at you or when you don't like somebody because of the color of their skin or their phenotype. It's also when you have one set of children that is not necessarily dependent on the public school to get their food, to get their health, to get whatever services that they deserve, or to get those government forms that are so crucial for them to get those services. But then you do have a set of vulnerable kids that actually does need all those things and need school to be open to do that. When you have that type of disparity, then yes, like that's the understanding that we have to come in with. People like to say that, well, if we want people to be anti-racist, all we have to do is work on them and their implicit bias. Like that's all it is. And I think we can do better if we just try to be kind to each other. It's like, yeah, be kind, but then also talk about these things that kids actually need, kids deserve, and the ways that parents too have to be able to respond to the situation, right? There's some set of parents who get to work from home, and then there's one set of parents who, unfortunately, they don't have an opportunity to work from home because they are the essential workers, because they've been told to go to work. And so when you have that disparity, and we know what that looks like, right, for so many of our kids, then we know for a fact that like the folks who are most marginalized in our public school system inherently end up being the ones who are least food secure, least health secure, and least child care secure. So in that way, we need to be able to reshift our system to be focused on the folks who need all these things to be open, or at the very least, to serve them in the best ways possible.
And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, when we talk about this situation of bias and implicit bias, that you just don't deal with implicit bias as concrete racism. There's a lot of other things. But I want to go back and talk a little bit about, the understanding, because I don't think sometimes that people have the full understanding as to what communities of color are really dealing with. So give me a little bit about the future. What do you have on tap coming up in the near future for EduColor?
More than anything, it's actually trying to create a systemic solution across the nation's largest public school system. For a long time, EduColor stood as the organization that tried to work wherever we could, get in the pockets of folks who would try to listen to us. And then wherever they didn't listen to us, we at least tried to help the teachers of color survive in those spaces. Like, that was our thing. And we have so many people who are on staff who have been fired or pushed out or pushed aside by their own school systems, even when they were trying to do best in those spaces. But now, I believe, because we're trying to become more institutional, it really is about looking at every school and saying, how does this curriculum best serve our kids? How does this professional development that you're doing, that you have adults sitting there with their eyes open for about 2 hours, right? How does that thing help our teachers become more culturally responsive and anti-racist? How does this policy that you created make it so that everybody in the school system, including our most privileged folks, understand that everybody deserves a full and equitable education, right? So like, think about the process that EduColor got to be part of last year with a coalition of really great folks underneath the umbrella of the NYU Metro Center, where we actually got to build the definition of culturally responsive and sustaining education for the NYC Department of Education. That was great, and we got it pushed in last July, I believe it was. And so in the midst of that, we recognized how this is a struggle, because they didn't understand that this definition wasn't just centered on Black and brown folks. It was centered on everybody, and making sure that, because I mean, think about it. Why would you want a pedagogy that suggests that your kid doesn't belong? Like, just
Right.
saying that alone, right? You tell a kid, oh, you don't belong in my classroom. Okay, well, that doesn't happen normally or typically to so many of our white peers who are in those private schools, because like, they belong or else. Meanwhile, so many of our Black and brown children who do go to schools often feel like they don't belong, but that pedagogy is for everybody. Telling our kids that they belong is for everybody. Telling all of our kids that they are gonna get a full meal is for everybody, right? But until everybody gets it, then it is not equitable. And so in the ways that EduColor can actually help promote and advocate for the kids who are most marginalized, to advocate for the teachers of color who are often the ones who've been anti-racist way before it got popular, we can advocate for the principals who are trying to create space for that kind of action to happen, in the ways that EduColor can do that in the future, and very soon future, in the next month even, we'll be doing that thing.
Well, Jose Vilson, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us here on the show. A great conversation. Listen, we got to bring you back and discuss a little bit more about EduColor and really this whole issue of educational injustice.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, if you don't know, he's the author of a couple of books as well. And before we go, tell us about the books too you got.
Well, my baby is called This Is Not a Test, a new narrative on race, class, and education. It's a book dedicated to those of us who've been doing the work forever and a day. It starts off with my own personal story, but it's a story that connects to so many of our students. And it talks about all the teachers who stayed and our visions for what racism looks like and what anti-racism might look like in this moment, and thinking about the ways that we can do better as a city and as a country, and for any educator who just wants to do right by kids and their communities.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us, Jose. Glad to have you sharing with us.
Thank you for having me.
All righty. Listen, we want you to stay with us. We do have more show coming up. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll continue more on the Social Justice Forums.
It looks bleak. It feels bleak. But the city isn't shut down, because our public services keep working, in spite of and in the face of the dangers. We can count on them. And to keep them working and funded now and in the future, we need to be counted. Self-respond now to the 2020 census at my2020census.gov.
Hi, I'm Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr., and I'm making sure that the Bronx counts is my priority. That's why I'm urging everyone to fill out the 2020 census. The 2020 census is important because it would allow for the federal government to determine how much money and resources the Bronx is going to need for the next 10 years around healthcare, education, housing, roads, representation, and so many other things. What does it mean exactly? Just imagine if you are organizing a party or an event and you send out 100 invitations, but only 50 people RSVP'd, and you only prepared for 50 people, and yet 100 people showed up. You're gonna be short of food, seats, tables, chairs. That's why it is important that 100% of us here in the Bronx fill out the 2020 census. It is easy, it is confidential, it doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or undocumented. We need everybody to fill it out. Now let's all get together and make the Bronx count.
And welcome back to the show. The Power of One Foundation is a not-for-profit organization with a focus that's on fighting hunger as well as poverty, providing food assistance and vital resources to vulnerable communities and individuals in Orange County, California, as well as beyond. The foundation's purpose is to empower residents in underserved communities to become leaders within those communities, regardless of their country of origin, race, gender, or socioeconomic status. Their vision: feeding those who are hungry, loving those who are alone, serving where there's a need, and making a significant impact in ending hunger and poverty, both locally and globally. We're pleased to be joined by Roberson, who is the executive director of the Power of One Foundation, who now gives us a little bit more about this wonderful organization. And Andre, great to have you.
Thank you for having me, Daren. I'm excited to be here and love doing what we're doing and love sharing any information we can that lets the community and let people within America know what we're doing during this time, during the COVID pandemic crisis.
Yeah, I think the COVID-19 pandemic crisis brought a lot of things out. And I mean, we found a lot of holes that need to be filled. But then we found a gap that really came when it came to the issue of hunger. With more and more Americans being laid off, more children not having access to meals, hunger became paramount. So give us a little bit about the Power of One and how you guys are actually helping to address that issue, particularly in this pandemic.
Well, for us, we have been doing food for the last 15 years, doing distributions, feeding low-income families, and feeding the homeless. We have a kitchen that feeds the homeless 5 days a week. So when the pandemic hit about February into March, I was just led inside of myself to start doing weekly distributions because I was kind of tracking what it was doing in China before I got here, and I was praying that it would not get to us the way that it got to China. But once it started to get out here and we started to see the numbers spike and what it was doing in California, we decided to start doing weekly distributions. And what I did was talk to my food vendors and said, hey, you know what? I need enough food for 10,000 people because I saw it. So my first distribution I did, which was actually fell on my monthly distribution, I ended up with 10 miles worth of traffic.
Wow.
And from there, the police department shut me down three weeks in a row. But it let me know what the need was, how desperate the need was during the pandemic, and it really let me know, wow, this pandemic has really arrived. Then once we started quarantining and everybody had to stay at home, nobody's working, business owners are losing their job, you got employees that are getting furloughed, and you have people that are just being let go. So you accumulate that with the recipe of COVID-19, have a lot of need that's needed in our communities, and a lot of us had to team together to be able to support the people within our communities.
Yeah, you talked about, let's go back here for a minute. So you started out and you had a distribution. As you had this distribution, you're saying you've got miles of cars who are trying to really get to you, and the police shut you down?
Yeah, the police shut me down. They were like, okay, you know what? It's public safety, because I had, when you got a mile, 10 miles down, and people are in your line and people are cutting in and out, there's people getting out of their cars about the fight, because I've had people in my line for 2 or 3 hours waiting to get food. There's people that had to get out of the line just simply because they had their child with them and they had to go to the bathroom. So these things that I felt also too that needed to be worked on. But for me, I was glad that the police department partnered with me, instead of just shutting me down and saying, oh, you can't do this, because they saw the need as well. So it was an area for me to be able to partner with the police department to create that type of relationship with them.
Yeah, it's important, I think, that, that we understand the magnitude of hunger and the amount of people who are really dealing with this issue on a daily basis. And I know that, you've got your organization that's doing boots on the ground out there in California, but you also talked about California and beyond. So give us a little bit about the work that's going on, not just in California, but across the United States.
Well, for the last 5 years, what we've done is we've sent over 3 million pounds of food to Mexico. We've also sent resources into Guatemala. For us, we had the opportunity of building relationships early to be able to make that happen. So we've been able to go into colonies. Also built a relationship with the UCLA Medical Center. So we combine food and medical supplies that we sent over into different areas of Mexico, all the way from Chiapas into Tijuana. And then beyond that, we've created partnerships with IKEA in California to be able to create a base model by way we can use their stores for distributions all across the United States to be able to feed people within the surrounding communities of that particular IKEA, which is the model that we're testing out right now with the IKEA in Costa Mesa.
And when we talk about this, I mean, there was an issue before COVID-19. What have you seen since COVID-19 in the area of food insecurity?
Well, out here in California, 1 in 7 people have experienced lack of food resources. So when you start looking at the COVID-19 pandemic, this took everything and amplified where you had to feed one family. Now you have to automatically feed 10 families. So it increased all numbers. You go from doing a normal monthly distribution where you're covering anywhere from 500 to 1,000 families to where now we're feeding over 100,000 individuals on a weekend.
Wow. And then when we talk about, the partnership, tell me about the partnership that you have in terms of, you're able to distribute food, but you're also able to have these wonderful partners that actually help you to be able to do that. Talk to me about that partnership and also them recognizing the need.
Absolutely. So when we got into the pandemic, number one, we're a small organization. We're not your Red Cross. We're not, your Food for Hunger. For us, we were a small organization that actually grew really big. So we needed a lot of financial resources and other in-kind resources to keep up with the demand that we were having every Saturday. Then after that, we also started to support like 30 other agencies that we were supplying food for. So for us, having partners like the Chargers Impact Fund, Chargers football team, their Impact Fund donated to us. Angels Baseball out here, they donated to us. Partnering with IKEA, partnering with Cimex, which is a cement company, which came in that donated. Partnering with other companies like Northgate Markets, who donated us a facility, 30,000 square feet. Northgate Markets, and along with donating products to us like tortillas and put into the boxes, having a partnership with the Orange County Food Bank, Capo C, having partnerships with the Orange County Fairgrounds, Main Place Mall, City of Santa Ana, City of Costa Mesa, the mayors within these cities that have come forward to be able to say, we see what Power One is doing. We see what your partnership with Official No One Left Behind is doing. We need you guys to keep doing what you're doing right now. And oh, by the way, can you support other people as well? Because you have congressmen, senators, and city officials that are sending people that are coming to them our way.
And we talk about the power of one. It's really one can make a difference. And for you, it's been the opportunity of just taking a small organization and doing great and mighty things. Talk to me about the power of one and how it all came about.
Okay, so the Power of One originated really from my mom and my grandmother. We own another nonprofit, which is Official No One Left Behind, that I started with them. And that was the beginning of the food process of this. From this, I've also been into acting and television. And through me doing records and albums and owning radio stations, my mom was like, okay, you know what, you need to give back in a different way. So I came up with a title song called Power of One, which then led into the Power of One Foundation, because we wanted to keep everything uniform with the message and showing the power of what one individual can do. Hence, here we are, fast forward 15 years to Power of One Foundation.
Yeah. And talk to us about your career, because we do know, and I didn't mention it in the beginning, that just, we're sticking with the Power of One, but you are an accomplished actor, and also you've been accomplished in the music field as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been really blessed in that area. I've done a stint on Days of Our Lives, did over 150 episodes there. I was in Notorious. I've done everything from Nike, Ford, Taco Bell, Fox Sports West, as far as on the commercial side. So, Hollywood has been good to me. And I have a whole bunch of other projects that I'm doing right now. I just finished up my music show. I'm getting ready to go in production on another movie. Works right now. And I've done 2 albums that I released to Warner Brothers. And now we got the Power of One single out that's going to go in to be nominated for a Grammy. So I'm feeling really blessed right now. And all of these are efforts that I'm using to be able to bring resources back to my nonprofit.
Andre, you did all that. You talked about all that stuff you did. How you gonna forget about my show, The District?
Yeah, man.
Like that's my show, man. You just like left that out.
Oh, yeah, man. The District, Angel, Untitled Sunset Strip, Dangerous Minds. I've been blessed, brother. I mean, I'm not complaining.
No, and listen, I mean, and I'm just teasing you, but I did love The District and the great work there. But I want you to share about that because listen, it's important. I think, you've parlayed a career, right? You've taken a career that's been, in front of the camera, music, and you've turned it around and you said, I'm going to use it for activism and social justice and feeding people and dealing with the hungry and dealing with poverty. Where did that shift come in, or was that there all along?
It was actually there all along because that's something that my grandmother instilled in me. You have to understand a little bit about my history. My history is this. I was born into a family and business that takes care of the mentally challenged still to this day. We've done it for 48 years. So for 48 years, we've taken care of the mentally challenged. So we've come from a heart of servitude. That's what I was born into. And so my grandmother taught me at an early age, 13 to be exact, I'm taking care of 10 consumers. You're born to be a leader. You were born in the servitude. The truth will set you free. Nothing from nothing leaves nothing. So no matter where you're at in this world, no matter how high up you go, remember where you come from and remember that you always have to give back because you're not always on the top. And the same people you see on the way to the top are the same people you're going to see on the way down. So treat people and be there for people. And if there's something that you can do it.
Yeah. And while you're doing it, what are you learning in this stage? Because obviously COVID-19 has exposed a lot of things, but what are you learning about the work that you're doing right now?
With the work that I'm doing right now, what I'm really learning is I'm learning that there are a lot of beautiful people in America. See, there's a lot of negativity that's promoted. There's a lot of things going on that is causing unrest right now. But through this ugliness, you tend to see a lot of beautiful things, tend to see what God is doing. So for me, in seeing these miracles happen every day, you have to realize I do distributions. I have about 5 to 6 distributions a weekend, which means that I'm dealing with over 100, 150 volunteers. I've been doing this since February. COVID-19 has no names, no boundaries. I have not had one COVID case through any of my distributions. Just me, myself, putting myself out there, putting myself at risk. I've been able to do this and move forward, and the community has stepped forward. So I'm learning unity. I'm learning collaboration, and that for all the people that say that there's a lot of community that doesn't care, there's a lot of community individuals that do care, and they're voicing their opinions, and through that collaboration of voicing your opinions, change is happening.
Right. And I want to highlight this here, right? Because in the work that you've done over the past 6 months, you fed over 1 million families, 1 million families over the course of the last 6 months. But most of all, you've been able to do this with no national assistance. So as the people say, what's the secret sauce in being able to feed 1 million people 6 months, no national assistance?
That's a good question. What is that recipe? I'd have to leave that with the man upstairs because I'm just walking it. I'm footprints in the sand. He's ahead of me. But in reality terms, this is my thing. I feel that the 15 years that I had been doing this had prepared me for this pandemic, if that makes any sense.
Right.
A lot of people came into this and started doing distributions as the pandemic started. I was doing distributions 15 years leading up to this. So once the pandemic hit, and dealing with so much food over a 15-year period, I was able to stretch my resources. I was able to look at the landscape and say, okay, we don't have just 300 cars here. We actually have 8,000 cars here. It helped me prepare to where I can not only just be in one part of the city, I can be in 6 to 7 parts of the city. It taught me how to take what I've learned over 15 years and give that knowledge to someone else so that they can apply it, so they can do the same thing that I'm doing. So now we're stretching the reach out.
Right. And this is a family initiative. I mean, you said it was instilled in your grandmother, your mother, and now yourself. What do you want to pass on to people on the area of giving back, and also being able to pay it forward?
The one thing that I want to pass on to people is, number one, have faith in yourself. If you have an idea and a concept to help your next brother or your next sister, don't let lack of resources stop you. Just get on the road. Get on the road, have faith, and move, and you will slowly see the community and resources appear to be able to expand that vision that you have, because there's someone else in that same part of town or maybe across town that has that same heart perspective and view perspective that you do, that wants to accomplish the same goals as you. So I say move, and always remember, keep respect of the other person and what they're going through in mind, and use your heart's compassion. And there's nothing that one person can't achieve.
Yeah. And you also talk about food, but I also noticed you also do diapers as well.
Yeah, we're part of the diaper bank. So with our distribution with IKEA, we provide diapers, and that's a much needed service. I mean, that we found over the last 6 months, you know, being able to give food and diapers to a mother who can't afford any diapers right now has been a heart changer for us. You know, you got little kids in the back seat holding up heart signs, saying thank you. Moms going through your line crying, talking about they didn't know where they were going to be able to get diapers, or there was no diapers in the store. So for us to be able to handle that need is something that's really, really dear to us.
Yeah.
Pretty soon, we'll be heading into housing as well.
Wow. Well, talk to us about the future, because you're talking about pretty soon heading into housing. What's the future looking like for the Power of One?
The future for Power of One is we want to be able to start Power of One distribution centers all across the United States in different cities. We also want to start our housing initiative, which allows us to build houses for veterans and low-income families. We actually have our first 40 acres that are donated to us out here in the desert that we're going to be able to start this project on. We're also part of a theme park that's going to deal with all nationalities, cultures, which is going to be called One World, that I'm really excited about. And then in the not too distant future, we also have some human trafficking initiatives that we'd like to get into.
Yeah, I think the country right now is at a pivotal place, and obviously a seminal moment in terms of activism. And you have already been engaged in activism, and it's almost like, you know, it's just come full circle. It's almost like with lack of better saying, a perfect storm, where now your resources are meeting up with what you've already done, and now things are just colliding for you. Do you feel like, you know, that things are just like coming full stride?
Absolutely. You know, I'd have to agree with you there. You know, it's funny. You know, I've done this for 15 years. Me nor my family have ever made a paycheck from this. Not from the other nonprofit and not from this nonprofit. No one makes a paycheck. You know, I apologize that it took a pandemic for people to see the work that we've been doing. But that's what it took. It took a pandemic for people to see what we've been doing in the community, and how the community and the higher ups are standing behind us because of the purpose and what we stand for. And we're not just talk, we're action. You see it in the community, you experience it.
Go back to me for the food distribution component, because when we talk about giving away food, you got to get your food from somewhere. Talk about that partnership with the food suppliers, and how hard was that to convince them that this was the right thing to do and also to be a part of the program?
Now, you know, beautiful part about my partners is, number one, if I would have went in there and asked them, could I do what I've done that allowed us to move forward to feed 1.5 million people, they would have told me no. So I went in there with having a 14-year partnership with them, and I said, hey, you know what? I'm part of this program. Can I have enough food to feed 7,000 people? They just so happened to give it to me. When they gave it to me, I knew what to do with it. And then once I showed them physically what I can do, that allowed them to really see, oh, wow, this is how he's doing it. This is the way he set up his system. Let's help him keep this going. So the Orange County Food Bank, along with the LA Food Bank, Food Forward, have really been my champions, because you have to realize they supplied me over 80,000 boxes a week that we were giving out in phase 2. In phase 1, we were doing about 60,000 boxes a week. Now we're in phase 3. Phase 3, we're ramping up and also moving outside of the country, and moving over to different states. So their partnership and their support has been key to the success of Power of One and the Official No One Left Behind.
Amazing, amazing work. And when you say these families being fed, as I said before, over the course of 6 months, 1 million families fed with no real national assistance. And when people talk about getting federal funds or needing these funds in order to be able to make it, you've proven that it can be done, and sometimes you don't have to rely on the government to be able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm just, I was raised like this. Don't sit and wait for somebody to help you. Figure it out, move forward, get it done. And, I said, I don't know how many people would sacrifice on the level that we've done it, but this was our calling. And there were many days that I'm sitting up here like, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? But then I go to a distribution and I have a little kid going through the line with a sign talking about thank you so much, or a family walking up to me like we had no food in our refrigerator. You just gave us 80 pounds of food, 100 pounds of food, and oh my God, thank you. And so that kept me going every week. And so I'm like this, when your heart is in the right and you know what you're going to do, don't worry about the big corporate sponsorship, different things. That's going to come. They got to see what you're doing, and they got to join the fight if they really care for their community and the community that they're serving and the community that are buying their products.
Right. And I mean, here's this. When you're doing the work, you'll be recognized for it sooner or later. And obviously, the time is coming now where you're actually being recognized, the power of one. So give somebody, from your perspective, a motivational message, if you will, about just being that one and how one could actually make a difference.
Well, I'm like this, talking to that person. Number one, you have enough strength to move this whole world. And all of us are connected in some way, shape, or form. No matter your nationality, no matter what language you speak, we're all connected. So if you're willing to put yourself out there, you got to be willing to put yourself out there with no expectations. You have to believe in what you're doing and know that it's right for yourself and right for the person that's next to you. Your heart will lead you in the right directions, and other people that have the same heart capacity you do will join you. It's inevitable because it's the law of nature and energy.
Andre, it's been great connecting with you, and I want to leave you with the opportunity before we go to just tell people how they can get connected to you, how they can get connected to the power of one.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on and just allowing me to speak from my heart and tell everybody about the Power of One Foundation. And you can find us at powerofonefoundation.org. You can find us on our social media, Instagram, Facebook, Power of One Foundation, POOF, POOF, which is Power of One Foundation, because we poof everybody. We let them know so they can join us. And those are some of the immediate best ways to get us. And on our website, we have a lot of information about the program, different things and food that we supply. And we have our emails and different things on, so contact us.
All righty. Andre Roberson, our guest, CEO, Executive Director of Power of One. Thank you so much for being with us here on the Social Justice Forum, making a difference across the world. Over the course of the last 6 months, 1 million families being fed through the Power of One. Thank you, my brother.
Thank you. I thank the Social Justice Platform for having us, and we look forward to having an update in the future because we're headed towards 2 million right now.
That's what I'm talking about. All right. Well, that's Andre Roberson, our guest here on the Social Justice Forum. And that about wraps up for this show. Want to thank you for joining us. Listen, next week you can join in on the discussion. Be sure to hit our social media platforms so that you can also share and engage in the conversation. We'll come back next week with another very special guest and the Social Justice Forum. I'm Daren Jaime saying take care. God bless. We'll talk to you soon.